Hello, comrades, and welcome back to another episode of Ushanka Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. Здравствуйте, дорогие товарищи! В эфире программа Ushanka Show. If you're new to my channel, my name is Sergei Sputnikov, aka John Wayne Cheeseburger, and back in 1971, I was born in the USSR. Okay, so recently I got a question from Nick Johns 9278 who asked about the video about firefighters in the USSR, and he also asked were apartment fires a regular thing. Okay, so before we talk about Soviet firefighters, let's talk about apartment fires in the Soviet Union because it's actually a really good question. Funny thing, when I started thinking about fires in the Soviet apartments, I thought about my experience in the United States of America back in 1995. This is what I wrote in my American Diaries 1995 on September 26. Soon we could see the gray mass of tall skyscrapers in the distance, downtown Chicago. All four lanes were packed full despite the early hour. Suddenly, I noticed a very familiar sight among the alien megapolis landscape, a row of brick high-rises, the apartment buildings that you couldn't imagine any Soviet city to be without. My goodness, Glenn, I yelled and pointed at it. Back home, I live in a building just like that. Glenn smirked at me and shook his head. Really? You live in the projects? What is the projects? I had no idea what he was talking about. Andrei was no help. He just grinned and pointed back towards the approaching buildings. I looked closely and detected something really bizarre. Almost every high-rise had boarded windows and spots where the walls were charred black from fires. I had never seen anything like it. Mind you, I had lived in apartment buildings my whole life. What in the world is going on here? I asked, dumbfounded. Before we arrived at the airport, I learned a good deal about the affordable housing projects, food stamps, gangs, the Cabrini Green fiasco, and other fascinating details about the life of poor people in America. It was a real eye-opener. Actually, later I found out that we were driving by so-called Robert Taylor Homes, which was a public housing project in south side of Chicago between 1962 and 2007, and it was the largest housing project in the United States that consists of 28 vertically identical high-rises. And I lived all my life in the vertical identical high-rises. Mine were 9-story high, but we also had 16-story high buildings. And I find it very interesting that these public housing projects were quite a success in the Soviet Union. It provided affordable housing for millions of people. Meanwhile, in the United States, same kind of idea, affordable public housing failed dramatically. And I believe those high buildings were demolished, not only in Chicago, like Cabrini Green is gone, there's Robert Taylor Homes gone. I think St. Louis took down their apartments. So it failed dramatically, while in the Soviet Union, it was doing just fine and still doing fine. And I think the main reason why it failed in the United States but it was so successful in the Soviet Union, because for the Soviet citizen to live in an apartment, that was like a better way than have your own house. Because if you had your own house, that meant you have outhouse, you have probably no running water. It was just like really primitive, pretty much log cabin or brick little building without any modern conveniences, while apartment building offered hot running water, cold water, bathrooms. So that was the kind of the way to go. And since it was affordable, we had everyone, well, almost everyone was poor, but that was premium housing for us. While in America, these public housing projects were pretty much exclusively for poor people. And I'm looking at that Wikipedia article, and it says that in Robert Taylor Homes, a survey was conducted and showed that the majority of residents either had a family member in prison or expected one to return from prison within 2 years. Meanwhile, in my apartment building, we had a family next to us. They weren't doing really good because the guy was hardcore alcoholic. So they were a little poor. They were borrowing money from us to make it till the next, call it paycheck. We didn't have paychecks. Meanwhile, like apartment above us, it was a successful family. The guy was an engineer. She was a teacher in some college. So they were like well-to-do people. Later, they even they could afford to buy a car. So Soviet apartments was a mixture of pretty much all groups of people, blue collar, white collar, and everything between. And my family lived in the Soviet high-rise apartments all our lives pretty much. I lived till 1998, and I don't recall a single fire in our building or any fires in nearby buildings. Sure, fires occurred, but nothing nearby what I remember. And of course, since the mass media, newspapers, radio, TV would never make reports about fires, so if there was a fire on the other side of town, we will never find out about it because it would be never in the evening news or anything like that. So, information was kind of, I think it's the word, compartmentized. So maybe neighbors knew about the fire, but no one else did. What I remember the main problem is smoking. So people who would smoke cigarettes on the balconies, they will toss cigarette butts outside. They will, extinguish or not extinguish. They're just gonna chuck them outside. And if there'll be a windy day, it could fall on the balcony below. And if people store some stuff, maybe old newspapers or whatever else, it could catch the fire. So I remember that was the issue. That's one of the reasons why my dad, pretty much right away after we got our apartment back in 1981, we had 2 balconies. He actually built like windows, so he made those balconies kind of like enclosed. So this way it prevented from cigarette butts to fall in and start the fire. But still, when I started thinking about it, I'm surprised that there was so little amount of fires, because otherwise I would know about them. Because, most men smoked, most men consumed a lot of alcohol, and that's quite often what would happen. A person will smoke while drunk on the couch watching TV, falls asleep, and that's how it starts the fire. But I believe married couples, women actually were pretty hardcore. Like my mom put her foot down right away, and my dad was not allowed to smoke in apartment, even on the balcony. He had to go outside and have a smoke. So this way, our apartment never smelled like cigarettes, and it's of course reduced the risk of fire. So I think one of the reasons why we had so little fires is Soviet women that kept their men in line. And if you take into consideration the fact that most Soviet apartment buildings had natural gas, it's even more amazing that we had such a low amount of fires. So we cooked on natural gas. So every apartment had in the kitchen a gas stove, except 16-story apartments, and those had electric stove. So yeah, I don't recall much kitchen fires as well. So this is pretty impressive to think about it. Unfortunately, I don't have any numbers to prove it, but I believe the issue with house fires existed in much grander scale out in the country, in the villages, because people used wood-burning stoves to keep their homes warm. A lot of them used it daily also to cook in their brick stoves. So then you have way more issues, because if you don't clean your chimney regularly, the whole stove can catch fire. Then if, something will roll out the stove and fall on the floor, it can catch fire. And of course, moonshining. I believe a lot of fires happened because people were doing moonshining operations, or as we call it, cooking borscht in the barn. And that's what was the reason of many fires out in the country. A while back I made a video about my experience of making moonshine with my grandpa, and I'll provide the link below in the comment section. But we did it in his small barn where he stored hay. So you can imagine if somebody is making moonshine and maybe start drinking fresh moonshine, pass out cold, it's easy to set the whole place on fire. And we had one street in our village called Rosha. And that place was notorious for moonshiners and it was like hardcore alcoholics. So that place had fires quite often. Like it was well known that that whole street burned out completely several times over the years, because once one house will catch the fire and the wind is blowing the right way, then the whole street will burn down to ashes, because every building is a log cabin. Okay, boys and girls, I think I'm done padding this video, and now it's time to get to the point and talk about Soviet firefighters, советские пожарники. If fire burns in a neighbor's house. Who you gonna call? Пожарник! Also a while back I made a video about telephone service in the Soviet Union, and once again, if you missed it, a link will be in the comment section. And there I mentioned there were several numbers that you could call free of charge. And every Soviet payphone had a little placard attached which says «Бесплатно вызываются», so free calls, «Пожарная охрана» 01, so firefighting service 01, «Милиция», militia or police 02, «Скорая помощь», ambulance 03, и «Служба газа», so natural gas service 04. So to call firefighters, all you need to do is just pick up the phone and dial 01. Otherwise, the cost of the local phone call was 2 kopecks, 2 копейки. Okay, so I'm not sure how many of you guys like that I include short lessons of Russian language. If you like it or not, please put in the comment section, because then I can just drop it. I don't have to do it, but I thought it was kind of beneficial for my videos and for your information. But I have to talk about Russian language in this case. And I don't know how many of you guys speak more than one language, but for those who do, especially if you speak second language fluently, at some point you will realize there's words that are missing in different languages. For example, in Russian language, we usually say ruka, and it means both hand and arm. Another example, in Russian language, there is no verb for to kick. So when you kick the ball, you say you strike the ball or you hit the ball. So it doesn't have actually a word to kick like with your leg. So it's kind of interesting, right? So guess what? When I was preparing for this video, I realized that English language is missing a word too. Like you guys have a word fire, and it means like campfire, and it means house fire. Well, in Russian language, they have a word пожар. And пожар, that's just like fire that you don't want somewhere. So it occurred in a house or an apartment. So if something is burning that you don't want it to burn, you call it пожар. And then, of course, if you have a fire like campfire, you call it костер. So the Russian word for firefighter is, well, it's complicated. Back in the Soviet days, when I was a kid, I always knew the word was пожарник. Пожарник. But sometimes in the late 90s, early 2000s, it's changed, and now they say пожарный. So it used to be пожарник, it became пожарный. And to make the matters worse, some people told me that now пожарник means actually the person who creates, like does the arson, creates the fire. So he's a пожарник. So we have this weird change of words from пожарник being a firefighter to пожарник being an arsonist. But when I was telling people, no, we used to say пожарник, and they'll get all angry with me, I'll send them a picture of this badge, which is called Excellent Firefighter, отличный пожарник. I was like, don't tell me that back in the Soviet days they would give a badge for excellent arsonist. So пожарник used to be firefighter. And back in the 70s, we also had this badge called юный пожарник. So that's a young firefighter. So someone who went to some kind of training for kids and excelled, or maybe he called the firefighters when he noticed the fire, he'll get this cute little badge, юный пожарник. And also notice that in the modern Russian language, they introduced a new word, which is kind of like a carbon copy of an English firefighter. It's огнеборец. It's more like fire wrestler. So now even пожарный is not being used a lot. They prefer to be called огнеборцы, fire wrestlers. Another interesting fact I must mention, Soviet Union, Soviet cities never had fire hydrants. Like in the cities, we don't have that stuff at all. And it was really bizarre to discover fire hydrants in American movies because, you know, it's a really popular thing to show in a Hollywood blockbuster when somebody plows in the fire hydrants and then this water shoots up in the sky. Soviet cities don't have that firefighting system, you know, providing water for the firefighters. And so they had to bring, when they come to fight fires, they had to bring tankers with them all the time because there is nowhere to get additional water. Similar situation out in the villages. I remember people are saying, yeah, they were fighting the fires, then they had to stop and drive to nearby lake to suck more water into the tank, come back and continue fighting fires. So there was different firefighting strategies. You have to minimize water usage and be smart. Okay, and now it's time to talk about Soviet firefighters and firefighting services in the Soviet Union. I was surprised when I discovered that Soviet firefighters belonged to the same ministry as the Soviet police. Of course, we call it militia back then, but firefighters and police were one department called MVD, Министерство внутренних дел, Ministry of Internal Affairs, and before that it was called NKVD, People's Commissariat of Inner Affairs. It wasn't easy to become a Soviet firefighter. First of all, you had to serve in a Soviet army. So you spent 2 years, being drafted in the army. After that, you could apply and become a student of the firefighting college. It took 3 years in the firefighters college to get graduated, and a person will get a rank of junior lieutenant. So this is how you start your firefighting career, becoming a junior lieutenant. And while you serve in the firefighting department, you can move up, of course, in the ranks, but your ceiling will be a major. You cannot move any further up without additional education, and the major will get you a job in the fire department as the fire department chief. And if you want to continue climbing up in the ranks, then you need to go back to school. So now you go to вуз, высшее учебное заведение. So it's like an institute of firefighting, and then you can move up to a general pretty much. And of course your pay would improve as you move up in your ranks, and I couldn't find exactly how much people used to make during the Soviet days as the firefighters. Doesn't sound like a lot of money, but there were some perks. One of the major perks, you could retire after 20 years of service. So you could retire pretty much at the age of 45. So that was great. And if you're a firefighter, you'll get a phone line in your apartment right away without waiting, because, it's part of your job. You need to be available to answer your phone. What I found interesting, so that part of the firefighting service was called военизированная охрана. So that's like armed firefighters, like armed with the side weapons. Then another part of the firefighting service will call professional, and as the people who served at the factories, like you need to have a fire brigade at the factory, so there'll be guys who work at the factory and also volunteer to be firefighters. That was called professional, which makes no sense. If you volunteer, you're not really a professional. Professional if you do it as your profession. So anyways, a little confusion there. So since the Soviet firefighters were part of the police force, they could be utilized for patrolling the streets or helping cops. So there were cases when the firefighters participated against demonstrations, because guess what? They had fire hoses and they could spray protesters with water. If you follow my channel, you probably know that I live in the United States since 1999, and I was surprised to find out, I live in a small town, that the firefighting department is kind of like a big deal. It's almost like a center of town. We have those pancake breakfasts all the time happens there. Firefighters is a big part of the community. We pay taxes. We pay additional taxes if they need to buy a new truck. So they were always visible here in America. But back in the Soviet days, I don't recall those fire departments were kind of hidden away in industrial areas. So I don't remember ever, firefighters interacting with the local population or doing anything like that. But I remember seeing a fire department back when I used to live in Kyiv. So I went on Google Maps and it's still there. So what's interesting, so you have 6 bays with firefighting vehicles and apartment building attached right there. So it's kind of convenient for the firefighters. Once again, you live in a big city, people don't have their own little, private homes. So you live in the building, and it's very convenient. If there's the problems or you're on duty, you're right there. You can sleep in your own bed. And then if it's a time, phone call comes in about fire, you just run into the bay, hop in the truck, and you're good to go. So I guess there was another big perk for the firefighter officers. Once you graduated as a junior lieutenant, you have the right to get an apartment right away from the government. So you don't have to wait like my parents had to wait. It was pretty much by law. If you graduate as an officer, doesn't matter, police, firefighters, or military, you have the right to get an apartment right away. And on this photo, you see a fire department in my village. I took this picture maybe 10 years ago while visiting my mom. So as you see, it had a bay for 2 cars and a watchtower. Of course, now it's all abandoned. I believe someone using this building to store hay for the winter. So we also had a small fire brigade in our village. I guess it was required. And I'm not sure how many people they had it full time. And then, of course, you had volunteers running to help. But this is what kind of your basic small village setup. When I was researching for this topic, of course, I ended up digging through a lot of Russian websites, and a lot of them claimed that the Soviet firefighting service was like a benchmark for the rest of the world. I neither can confirm nor deny those allegations. So when everything is centrally planned and the government spend money, it's not like based on the local community, how much money they have, how much taxes they pay. It's all money coming from Moscow. I'm not sure. In some regard, it may be good. In some regard, it may be not good, because definitely Moscow was probably a benchmark for the world, but not a small town or a small village like where I used to go. So for example, I found this slide kind of interesting. It says that in 1954, there were first examples manufactured for the firefighting trucks designed specifically for the villages. So first of all, what is the difference between firefighting truck, city firefighting truck versus village firefighting truck? Well, it needs to be all-wheel drive and lifted to go on dirt roads, because a lot of villages, especially in Russia, Ukraine had a little bit better situation with, asphalt roads. So there were pretty much dirt roads everywhere. So you need to have vehicles that could go off-roading and still fight fires. For example, this slide says that in 1952, they made a first modification of AN-2, famous Kukuruznik plane, that was modified to fight forest fires. Another example, 1953, they began manufacturing of the firefighting trucks like command and control. So this truck had a radio communication capacity and also additional lighting to provide. So it's definitely designed for the cities. In 1957, the Soviet Union began manufacturing firefighting trucks with automatic mechanical ladders. So once again, it's designed for cities. They started building taller buildings. They needed longer ladders. So they used this ZIL 157 truck and they put that ladder on it. 1954, they manufactured first test model of firefighting trucks. They used in chemical foam firefighting model. In 1956, for the very first time, they utilized helicopter to fight forest fires. 1961, once again, AN-2 Kukuruznik plane. Now they utilized the floating model, the one so you could land on the lake, suck some water in, and then take off and fight forest fires. 1962, they began manufacturing first firefighting trucks based on a ZIL 130. That's the most popular model of the truck in the Soviet Union and the firefighting truck. This is the trucks I remember from my childhood in the Soviet Union, the ZIL models. It says they were designing earlier, but they had shortage of trucks. So once again, that's your central planned economy. So they only could finish making test models for tanker based on this truck, as well as the pumper. And only in 1962, so initially they made the very first test models. Here's interesting pictures of the firefighters fighting water with water. I'm just joking. So there's example, as I said, we didn't have fire hydrants. So this is, you have a pumper that sucks the water out of the lake, and then it provides enough pressure to have several fire hoses working pretty decent. 1968, based on the Ural military truck, they started manufacturing so-called heavy-duty type firefighting tankers. So this one to bring more water to the place of fighting fire, since there's no fire hydrants. 1987, first flight of the firefighting plane Antonov 26P. And that's the airplane was manufactured in Kiev, and that's where my dad used to work. And look at this beast. It's called Лесопожарный агрегат АЛП-10. So this is a forest firefighting vehicle based on the tractor T150K. So it pulls a giant water tank and probably has a little pumper and a plow in the front. There's another Soviet beast. In 1978, they began manufacturing of a heavy-duty firefighting vehicle for the airports. And you might recognize this Truck, I don't know its name, but it's also being utilized to carry around giant nuclear missiles. Okay, my friends, it's all I have for you today. And by the way, fun fact, Comrade Sergey is also an American firefighter. In my place of work, I am required to be a member of fire brigade. So I go through all the training that required to be a real firefighter in the United States. I don't get paid any additional money for it, but every year I go through live fire training, SCBA training, and all other stuff that required to be done to be a qualified firefighter. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, please don't forget to like it, share with your friends, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye.